You saw the title. Let's talk about these young whippersnappers and how that dag-nabbit auto-tune is ruining music. Hold on. Not that kind of video. I think there's some other people who have that sort of thing covered. I actually really like music technology and find it really inspiring, but it hasn't always been that way. Now, maybe this is something you can relate to. You make a 4-bar loop or a sequence that you really like, and you think, that's really cool. I want to make something out of this. And then you sit there and you just listen to it over and over with really no idea where to go from there. I've certainly been there, but oddly enough, only fairly recently, after I started making electronic music with more modern technology. Before that, I was fully immersed in the world of classical piano, which I had been studying since the age of 8, went on to get a couple of degrees in it, and even had the opportunity to study composition in my master's degree. And around this time, instead of a sequencer, I was using a pencil and a paper and my piano. In fact, I didn't even know what a DAW was until about 2012, and certainly didn't realize that you're supposed to hate everyone who uses a different DAW than you do. It was a simpler time, really. And the real kicker, my music was better, at least at its core. So is music technology bad? Should I sell all of this stuff and just go back to writing at the piano with a pencil and paper? No, and maybe. Is music technology a tool or a crutch? I've heard people argue from both sides of the equation, and it's an almost impossible thing to answer because the choice is really up to you. It's up to me. It's up to the individual using it. A sequence or a loop can inspire a larger idea that you can flesh out. It can be the source of your inspiration. Ultimately, as composers, it's our job to take that fragment of an idea and develop that into something larger. And to do that, we need at least a basic understanding of form and structure and how to create variations and contrasting themes of an idea. Oh, hi. I realize this is going to be partially dependent on what kind of music you're making. Like, my music is kind of neoclassical ambient with strong melodic tendencies and maybe slightly more traditional harmonic progressions. And I do love a good 4-on-the-floor beat, just like the average middle-aged white guy. But I do think if you apply some of these concepts to almost any genre, it's really going to help move your listener emotionally, if you're interested in that and not just moving them across the dance floor. So how in the world, once we have an idea, do we create variations of that idea? We can have new texture, we can have new dynamics, we can have new melodic content, we can have the sound itself change thanks to synthesis and sound design and all the tools at our disposal. We can have, okay, I think I see the problem. It's not writer's block or lack of ideas, it's overwhelm at having too many options. And since the world of music today is basically limitless in the amount of things that we can create and the tools that we have to do it, you're gonna have to place some limitations on yourself. And you've probably heard that, but I'm going to try to give you some more practical examples. Maybe a lot of us got into music because we hate the idea of anyone placing rules upon us. We want to be rebels and not have any limitations whatsoever. But I think as you gain more maturity in the field and you start to work on the craft of composition more, you start to realize that limitations don't restrict your creativity. They actually focus it. They channel it into something usable. If you think about the musical scales and modes that are most common in Western music, those are just limitations that composers have used for centuries now to sort of guide their creativity. Try limiting yourself to only using 2 voices. Like if you have a synthesizer, only play 2 notes at a time. And what you'll find is that those 2 parts have to be much, much stronger and more independent than if you were just adding notes wherever you felt like it. Limit the rhythmic motion and only put faster rhythmic movement in places where you want to emphasize the melody, because our ear is going to be naturally drawn to those moments. And by knowing when not to move, you know where to place that emphasis. Now, these limitations seem very simple to implement, and in a way they are, and they will make your life easier in that you will have less overwhelm, but it will also make your life more difficult in the fact that your ideas will have to be stronger and be able to stand on their own. But if you take the time, for instance, to craft a well-designed melody, then when you start to build off of that foundation, you'll find that the whole thing comes to life in a much more satisfying way. The devil really is in the details, I suppose. Another way to kind of impose these self-limitations and make sure that you're actually taking the time to craft your ideas is to write them down. Now, thanks to music technology, we can use MIDI roll or piano roll now. So you don't even actually have to be able to read musical notation. I don't think that's a requirement anymore. But whether you're using a pencil and staff paper like I used to use in the past, or if you're using MIDI piano roll in your DAW, putting your ideas in some sort of visual form will make you refine them as you go. It's kind of a self-editing process that requires you to take the time to think things through, much in the same way as writing down a paragraph or an essay is different than just having a conversation. You choose every word much more meticulously, and you can really articulate what you're going to say. As you continue to go through this careful planning process that is music composition, you'll find that you intuitively can start to do some of these things in a sort of almost automatic way. That's where improvisation comes in. You might start improvising an idea on whatever instrument you play, and you'll find that those improvisations have more intention than kind of the random meanderings that you did before. Now, I've developed sort of a bad habit over the last 10 years or so that I've been making and releasing my own recorded music of just recording an improvisation, not taking that as an opportunity to refine an idea in the compositional process, but just putting it out there. And sometimes that's fine. I actually think that improvisation is great. And I think it's best used as a mining expedition where we find musical ideas, especially when we've taken the time to learn the craft of composition and can come up with better ideas more quickly. But there is still a pretty significant gap between improvisation and composition, in my opinion, because composition is the refinement of that mining expedition that we did before. Really going all in with the mineral analogy here. The issue with improvisation is we tend to revisit all of the same places that we've been before on our particular instrument, because part of playing any instrument is muscle memory. So once again, we could think of improvisation as just having a conversation with your friend. You're going to use words that you've used before, and composition, once again, as writing down an essay or something where you're choosing every word carefully. So that's cool and everything, but it seems very basic. And how do we apply these things to sequences and loops and synthesizers and all of the tools that we have at our disposal today? Well, just like when you start to understand more about the basics of synthesis and it starts to unlock things for you in terms of sound design, and you can then tweak presets to make them your own, the more we learn about the basics of compositional structure and form and how music is actually put together, the more we can break out of the 4-bar prison that we often find ourselves in. Even if we're using sequences and loops as inspiration, we are learning how to develop ideas. It's that old concept of giving someone a fish versus teaching them how to make their own fish idea. Me again. I think to put this simply in terms that relate to sequences and loops and music production, stop thinking of your loops as the end game or as a finished thought. They're not. They're just a part of an idea, like a piece to a puzzle. Personally, I still love lyrical melodies, and almost all of the most memorable ones are conversational. We may often refer to that as question and answer. This gives a melody natural shape and direction, and it really resonates with us as humans because it's how we communicate. So maybe that sequence or that 4-bar loop that you really love is just the question, and you need a compelling answer to go with that to make it feel like a finished thought. Even the most complex music written by the greatest masters of all time is just a series of little building blocks that they've taken and developed and switched around and moved around. They've tried different things, but you have to have really strong building blocks to begin with, and that's really the point of this video. You may have noticed that I didn't once talk about the circle of fifths, or how this one chord will change your life forever. And that's because composition and music theory not the same thing, even though you will see a lot of videos that confuse the two. Let's say that you asked an author that you really admire how they go about creating and crafting an idea and a narrative that holds your attention all the way through and has a satisfying yet unpredictable conclusion. And then they proceed to explain the difference between an adjective and an adverb. That's nice, but that's not really what you asked, is it? I'm not saying theory won't make your life easier. Just like it helps to know the basics of grammar in whatever language you're writing, it is helpful to know a little bit about musical grammar, and that's what music theory is. But theory is analytical. It's not creative per se. So I think you can actually learn more, just like using the author analogy again, by reading and seeing how stories are put together and how they advance ideas and pace a story. And then, of course, actually trying and failing repeatedly at writing yourself until you get better. I've found lately, for me, what is working best is to use improvisation to get the initial ideas out of my brain and onto a piece of paper, where I can then refine them and swap things around using form and structure and develop my ideas. You could do the same thing by just recording sections, and then you could swap them around in your DAW if you don't read music. And in this way, we can try different things. We can experiment, we can fail, we can get a little better each time until we have an iteration that we're really proud of. And we've broken out of just sitting there listening to the same 4-bar sequence over and over and over. I did put together a free ebook that actually goes into a little bit more detail about the things that I've discussed in this video. Hi, sorry to interrupt me, but you're going to hear me talk a lot about this composition ebook throughout the course of this very long video. And I wanted to let you know that I've just updated it with some new exercises that will allow you to put principles into practice immediately. And I pulled this directly from my Composition Clarity System, which is a new composition method that I've developed that's coming out this fall. Also, since this ebook has been downloaded about 30,000 times in the last 2 years, a lot of people requested me to make the background white so it would be easier to print, and I've done just that. And finally, as a bonus, you get my Harmony ebook, which is also free and came out last year, in that same folder when you sign up for the Composition ebook. So I hope that both of these ebooks together provide you with some more clarity and focus in your music moving forward. Stop trying to come up with chord progressions. Today I want to show you just a couple of concepts that we can use to transform the way we think about chord progressions and turn something like this into this. Everyone wants a shortcut to better chord progressions. Well, too bad, because this isn't about a new chord generator that will magically do it for you, or an ad for MIDI chord packs.
And this is super good for you, especially if you struggle with making melodies, chords, stuff like that.
Because those exist, apparently. I'm just going to show you an actual proven method that I use in my own music. That's pretty old, actually. But it's also still very, very effective, and there's probably a reason that it stood the test of time. And if you would like to make music that stands out from the crowd today, you might find it kind of interesting. A few months ago, I wrote a free ebook containing just some practical tips on composition that I've used for a lot of years now, and to my surprise, thousands of people downloaded it. In the section of this guide that talked about harmony and chord progressions, I mentioned something along the lines of think horizontally, not vertically. And then later it occurred to me that not everyone might understand what that meant, because some people reached out and said that they didn't understand what that meant. So let's dig a little deeper into what that means and how to actually do it. I know you're here for quick chord progression tips, not even the MIDI chord pack guys use. But before we get there, let's talk very briefly about melody. Now, stay with me, it ties in, I promise. I'm not going to go into how to write a melody today because I already did that last week. But there are some characteristics of strong melodies that we can directly apply to our chord progressions. Writing melodies that are singable almost always leads to melodies that are more memorable. But what actually makes a melody singable? Well, to oversimplify for the sake of this demonstration, linear, stepwise motion, and smaller intervals. If you've ever taken a piano lesson or had the privilege of listening to a student practice, you've probably heard something like this. You might notice, though, if we look at the score, that these don't look like our standard snowman triads. In fact, if we were to play this progression in that way, it would look and sound like this. Notice how unnatural that looks and sounds, and how we're kind of leaping and jumping all over the place. But by using inversions, which just means that we're taking all the same notes of that chord and rearranging them a bit, each of the 3 notes of the progression seem to go on their own linear melodic journey. So if we were singing each part, it would feel more natural to us. It's almost like we're thinking of a bunch of horizontal lines instead of a series of vertical chords. So let's start by not really thinking of chords in isolation. It is called a chord progression after all, and that means that no chord exists by itself, and also that those chord tier ranking charts that I've seen on Twitter lately really make no sense at all. So we've already seen that through redistributing our notes slightly, inversions, they start to take on the characteristics of a group of melodies rather than just a clump of notes. This is an older concept because it's the way that choirs work. Or ensembles like a string quartet, for example. Each individual player or singer is responsible for their own melodic line, and then when you put all of those together, it forms the vertical chord. I have before me a synthesizer. And I'm going to use it to write something in this sort of horizontal style. In fact, I'm going to start with just 3 voices. Now, I could do something simple like this. And because the patch is interesting and the sound design is pretty cool, maybe I could get away with that. Or I could make the part writing itself more interesting, doing something like this. Notice how it's mostly stepwise motion, and not only that, we have contrary motion, in other words, the parts are moving in opposite directions, between the soprano and the bass. We mentioned that a singable melody tends to have a lot of stepwise motion or smaller intervals, but that doesn't mean that we don't have any leaps whatsoever. It means we're saving the leaps for moments of emphasis. And this serves as a kind of plot twist in our musical narrative. Thanks, Melodies. We'll be taking that one to use in our chord progressions as well. The second time I do that, I'm going to make it a little bit more interesting by adding a plot twist or a leap. So not only does this method make our progressions more interesting, it also gives us a sense of line independence, which means we have more options with each of the lines themselves, since they are their own independent melody. I could play it in just 2 parts at a time. Or I could even record this as like a synth quartet. In other words, kind of like a string quartet, but with, well, you get the idea. I think I want a grungier bass on this. No, I already hate it. I need a conductor. We still have inner voices to record, but I have to set up my camera so that you can see that. Now, I know what you may be thinking. I don't just write ambient synth music. What if I wanted to do something a little bit more energetic? I don't really understand why you would want to do such a thing, but if you did, I actually think that these same methods, thinking about chord progressions in this way, can really help any style of music, any genre. Let's see if I can whip up something real quick to pull that off. What if we did like an ARP with that? Because, you know, the thing about ARPs is they're chords. They're just broken chords instead of block chords, and since we're thinking of things kind of horizontally and linearly anyway, let's try it. You know, I'm actually going to record just a layer of grungy overdriven just to tuck away in the background. Next, we need a really snappy bass part. I gotta stand up for this one, sorry. Just gonna put 4 on the floor. And let's do some sort of weird pattern, like maybe 7 steps, like so. So in my attempt to answer the question definitively, yeah, but can it slap? Here's this thing. So I think this can be used in multiple applications regardless of what style or genre you write in, and it's going to make your work stand out because people typically aren't thinking about chord progressions in this way anymore. Oh hi! If you're anything like me, the first thing you do when you get a new synth is something like this. And as much fun as it is to just latch an arpeggiator and let it run while you tweak knobs, it doesn't take long once you stop tweaking knobs to realize that wow, that's incredibly boring. So if you've ever been stuck in permanent arpeggiator lock, or if you've just been ripping off the Stranger Things theme for, I don't know, 7 hours or so, this is the video for you. If you're completely unfamiliar with a synth arpeggiator, it's simply a way that you can play block chords and it will break them up for you, or arpeggiate. If you're maybe a bit more of a traditionalist like myself, you may be more familiar with arpeggios as something that you practice for countless hours on the piano. Maybe something like this. I can choose different octave ranges. I can choose different algorithms for the order in which the notes are played. All kinds of different options, and it's a great way to come up with ideas that maybe you'd never think of on your own. Arpeggios are just groups of notes. They're just chords that are broken and played one note at a time. If you've been around this channel for a minute, you know that I like to think of chord progressions as part writing rather than just a group of blocked chords. That to me gets boring fairly quickly. But if we did something that had more line independence and we're thinking more horizontally or linearly, we might come up with something like this. I'm just making it up, not the best part writing in the world, but you get the idea. In fact, I have an entire video on that subject where I thought things through a bit more than I have here. If you'd like to check that out, I'll leave that in the end screen of this video. So instead of using what I affectionately like to call the three-fingered, chicken-footed producer technique, which when arpeggiated would sound something like this, if we simply use inversions, we could get to chords more smoothly from one to the other. It's an incredibly simple example of just a very standard cadence. I think one example of this and the way that I like to think about arpeggios is in my recent piano piece, the Waltz in G minor, which I've used as an example on this channel a couple times. The B section of this piece has a bunch of descending arpeggios in the right hand. And when I was improvising this, it all just was kind of one G minor arpeggio. And while this did give me the general shape and the general idea of what I wanted to accomplish in this section, I knew it was a bit too uninteresting harmonically. But my muscle memory had led me down this sort of all too familiar path, which is why improvisation can be a bit tricky and sometimes we need to take that another step further and compose. So it ended up looking something like this. There are all of these tiny pivots that are happening now that transform it from just being a straight G minor arpeggio to having some extended harmonies like sevenths and ninths and some little turns in there where we have some dissonances, especially in this second phrase. And here I've moved to D minor, but done it in a very linear way. So if I were to block that, I could do something similar with a synth arp and create a more interesting progression. All kinds of different variations that can be generated through an arpeggiator. If you do happen to be interested in the way that I approach modern composition, I have a free ebook that will be listed in the description. It'll be the first link there, and it'll take you through those things that I use all the time and that have helped me sort of overcome overwhelm and sort of narrow my focus creatively. So that's in the description if you want to check it out. But this is a really interesting approach. And speaking of approach, this piece, I kind of did the opposite. Instead of applying a more pianistic technique to a synth arp, I apply a synth arp style arpeggio to a piano piece. Specifically, I use the rigidness of this arpeggio as a feature instead of a bug. It's a 7-step arpeggio. It's a 7-step arpeggio, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that just repeats in 7, while a 4/4 pattern is happening underneath it. This is called a displaced arpeggio. Okay, I just made that up. The point is, both the rhythm and the chord of the arp are fixed. Never changes. It's what happens underneath that changes and provides the interest and the linearity, which is a big emphasis that I put in my music. I just don't want everything to be vertical like popular music often is today. I want there to be a sense of a through line, or a melodic idea, or a harmonic progression that tells a story and unfolds over time in a linear narrative way. There's a track on my last full album that basically came about simply through experimenting with an arpeggiator. In this case, I had 2 oscillators which were just droning a perfect fifth and stayed on that perfect fifth throughout, while the 3rd oscillator was arpeggiated, so it was playing this sort of simple progression over the top of that. And I built the entire track around that one element. And that's why I often talk about sound design as being something that can really be the foundation of a piece of music, and just through experimenting with sounds you can come up with things that you would never create otherwise. I truly believe that because it happens to me a lot. This track simply would not exist without experimenting with the patch. Oh, and it helps to have good friends who are really awesome musicians that you can invite to come and play on it. So taking all of this that we've talked about and applying it to a synthesizer, I think the Iridium is a really good case here because it can do layers and has a lot of voices. And layering the ARP with some kind of a pad underneath is a great way to demonstrate what's really happening. We're writing ARP progressions, but they're also just linear chord progressions. They're kind of like part writing. I'm a big fan of polychords, so I thought it would be cool to just experiment with some polychords using an ARP and also with that pad underneath like we talked about, just to fully demonstrate what's happening harmonically underneath that ARP. Just a simple example, but you could see where that's something that has a bit more interest and linear progression to it, and something that I think we could get more mileage out of if we wanted to build a track around it. I hope maybe this gives you some new ideas for ways that you can use arpeggiators in your music and make them a bit more interesting if you get easily bored by arpeggios like I do. When I started getting into synthesis, I heard this term thrown around quite a bit that I wasn't really familiar with. Pad. Beethoven didn't use a lot of pads, I guess. It seemed to describe these sounds that were kind of tucked away in the background of electronic tracks. Usually playing chords or providing the sort of harmonic backbone to a track, or maybe just as an underlying bed of textures that evolved over time. Beyond that, I really didn't know too much about them, but it didn't take me too long to realize that I absolutely loved them. But if you're anything like me and you make music with, let's call them ambient tendencies, there's a tendency to get so intoxicated with pads that they get kind of stagnant after a while. And I can easily get lost noodling around with synth pads for hours without ever actually making any music with them, which is kind of a problem for me since that's what I want to do. So today I'll show you some of the methods that I've used over the past decade and continue to use to this day to keep my pads more interesting, either through sound design or perhaps more importantly, like how we use pads in the music that we actually make and stuff. I have one extremely general rule when it comes to synth patches. The more complex or busy the patch, the less complex or busy the writing should be. And the simpler the patch, the more flexibility I have with the harmonies and the parts themselves. In other words, it's more playable if it's more of a simple patch. Essentially, I like to pick a leader, either the sound design or the notes themselves. And in that case, I'm using the synthesis as more like orchestration. But I'm also a big believer that if you have a cake, you should also figure out a way to eat it. So a little later in the video, we'll talk about some ways to combine these worlds and sort of walk that line between those two spaces. Cool sound design and linear harmonic progressions that make the music have some sort of emotional and linear direction and make it a little less stagnant. But first, let's talk about synthesis because I'm a huge nerd. Of course, to have a synth pad, we need a synth, don't we? I love a good old analog I love a good old analog polysynth as much as anyone. And they're really great for that second approach where, we have a more simple sound that is more playable and it just sounds good. Like, that's what they're good at. But if we really want to get a little bit more involved with our sound design, a little crazier maybe, a subtractive analog synth is actually pretty limited. So I'll show you some of my favorite types of synthesis that I like to use to make more interesting pads. And I'm gonna show you some specific synths, and it's just because those are the synths that I have. It's not because I want you to go and buy those. I'll give you some software alternatives as well as some free things that you can pick up and use right now. By the way, I'm sponsored by none of these gear manufacturers, nor the software companies that I'm going to mention. And that's how you can know that here on this channel, I am making no money through sponsorships. So let's do a speed run through synthesis, shall we? Instead of simple wave forms like you would find in an analog synth, your triangle, your sawtooth, your square wave, digital wavetables are capable of producing much richer and weirder harmonics, which means you start with something a lot crazier and then you can still shave it down with filters or whatever if you want to do that. But it also means they can sound really terrible and thin and nasal and really crappy. For a long time I thought I absolutely hated wavetables, but it turns out it's very dependent on which wavetable you're using and the sweet spots that you can find within that wavetable. And getting that wavetable moving a little bit is really important for creating evolving pads, which is what we're specifically talking about today. Just getting an LFO or something or an envelope to sweep through that wavetable provides much more interesting things than just having a stagnant wavetable with its weird buzzy harmonics just drilling away through your ear holes. So experiment with modulating the wavetable itself, the wavetable position. It's a great way to introduce some movement into your pads. A lot of you may have heard of Serum, which is a very popular soft synth, has been around for a really long time. But you can also download this free soft synth called Vital and get started exploring wavetables right away. Not right away, I mean you should finish this video and then do it. This is a Prophet 12. It's an older synth now, but I just picked mine up last year because Tony Anderson made me do it.
First of all, it was my first synth. And anyone who gets rid of their first synth is also a murderer on the side.
And I've discovered that it's really incredible for these types of evolving pads that we're talking about. It's also a wavetable synth, but it also can do FM, which when I discovered that and figured out it's actually a 4-operator FM synth, it really was like, a mind-blowing experience, and it really opened up the synth for sound design. Now this brings us to FM, which is one of the weirder types of synthesis, and you may have heard about how complicated it is, but fortunately I hate math, so I'm not going to talk about any of that. Okay, I lied. Let's talk about it just ever so slightly. To put it in its simplest terms, in FM synthesis you basically have oscillators controlling or modulating other oscillators. They're called operators in the FM world for some reason, but that really doesn't matter. Because you're modulating oscillators with high audio rates instead of a slow LFO or something, you get really crazy results. It can be really unpredictable and get out of hand very fast, and you also have to kind of watch, transposing your patch unintentionally, because when you use one oscillator to control another oscillator, it can change the pitch of that first oscillator, and then everything is playing in all kinds of weird atonal ways, and you just have to kind of use it judiciously. When you dial it in precisely with math and stuff, that's when you get the DX7 presets, electric pianos, bell-like sounds, piano sound-alikes, maybe those sounds that you associate with FM synthesis. But fortunately for you, I don't care about any of that. That's not what I like to do with FM synthesis at all. It's really fun to explore the cracks in between all of those right ways to use FM. Instead, I'd rather find weird sweet spots that are slightly disgusting, a little gnarly, but also evolving and have some hair on them. Like right on the verge of disintegrating and falling apart entirely, but still usable in a musical sense, or a playable sense. One other thing to note about FM, just as a side note, if you use sine waves, that's kind of the most predictable way to use FM in a musical sense. Once you start getting into using waveforms with more harmonics, like a sawtooth wave or, God forbid, a wavetable, then you can get some really crazy results, and that's worth experimenting with. I've actually discovered some really unique sounds by just trying things. There's almost nothing better than a great granular pad. Granular synthesis is a different kind of synthesis entirely. It is dependent upon a sample, and it takes that sample and it chops it up into all of these teeny tiny bits of samples that it then sprays across, the stereo field or the frequency spectrum or whatever in various ways. It kind of goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that whatever you feed into it, the sample, is going to determine what you get out of it. It's incredibly dependent on what you give it. So something static that just, sustains the same sort of thing and then never does anything else, like, I don't know, let's say a pipe organ. I don't know who would do that sort of thing, but a pipe organ, the sound doesn't really change a whole lot after you play the note and the note sustains until you release it. And so you can find some interesting sweet spots with sounds like that, but I've found that sounds that have a clear transient, like, I don't know, a piano, for example, are really, really good in granular synthesis. I've also done some stuff like singing into a granular synth and changing the vowel from like ooh to ah and stuff like that, and that works really well because it's evolving over time. You could also granularize one of your other evolving synth pads, you know, an FM pad or something that you just learned how to make in this very video. Something like Native Instruments Stray Light does granular really well. It's something that I use all the time in the software world. Or you could grab something like Arturia's Pigments, which does pretty much every type of synthesis that I'm talking about today and does it all really well and combines it in unique ways. Pigments is really good. It's kind of like having the Iridium in software. That's the Iridium. It grew a keyboard since some of the demos that you're seeing in this video. So now we have some really cool ways to make interesting sounding pads that have texture and they evolve over time and they're just fun to listen to. And now we just have the most important part, which is, what do I do with them? Pads can take up a lot of space in your track, both harmonically and in terms of the frequency spectrum that they take up. When we think of pads, we usually think of chords. And when we think of chords, we usually think of groups of giant notes together, big chords. We want our music to sound huge and massive, so obviously the more notes we can cram into a chord, the better it's going to sound, the bigger it's going to be, and the opposite is actually true. The simplest definition for a chord is any group of 2 or more notes. So what if we thinned our chords out to only 3 notes? And then that allowed more space for, I don't know, the bass or the lead or arps or sequences to happen around that. And everything is a bit more clear. What if we only used 2 notes at a time with a pad-like sound on a synth? Well, then we have to figure out like how to write good parts, which is another issue. But you'll notice that everything is really clear. You can hear everything that I want you to hear when I'm only using 2 notes at a time. You create more space, but then the notes that you do choose to use become more important. And I like to think in this way, more linearly, so rather than chord progressions, I think in terms of part writing a lot of the time. And if you want to read more about that or understand that more, I have a free ebook on composition that kind of goes over some of these techniques that I like to use the most. It's down in the description below, and it's free. You can also have your pads interact with the other elements in a track, like say some of the more rhythmic elements in a track, if you have rhythmic elements in your track. I don't always have drums in my music, but even something like an ARP or something with a transient attack. Transient. That's the one. Sidechaining is a common technique in electronic music. You can use it to make more space in your mix so that, I don't know, let's say when a transient hits, the pads, or the sustained elements, kind of duck out of the way and make room for that. Things were much better from what I remember. I could be wrong. Or you can dial this up for a more creative effect, like you'll often hear in dance music. And that actually serves the purpose of giving your pad some rhythmic element as well. And when you trigger that rhythmic movement with another element that exists within your track, that creates this sort of symbiotic relationship between all of the elements of your track. If you didn't grow up watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine, that just means that they work together and play off of each other. Sometimes it's better to take stuff out than to add more stuff. I think a lot of times for me, I find that to be the case. If you have a track that you started with the pad, which often happens for me because I tend to improvise with my pads in a linear sort of fashion like we talked about, so I'm starting with the pad and then I leave the pad in for the whole track, you start to forget just how much of the frequency range that pad takes up. It takes a lot of space. So try picking a few moments in the track and muting the pad, and see if everything that you've built around that pad starts to kind of spring into action and come to life. After you've experimented with trying this in a few different places, once you find those right moments, it can really breathe life into the track without you having to go and add a bunch of stuff or create new sections to try to add contrast. Maybe you just need to take this thing out for a few measures. For today, I hope that this has given you some ideas on how you can use pads more effectively. Not only how to spice up how they sound, but also how to actually use them in your music. I love a good sequence. Synth sequences, box sequences, Fibonacci sequences. And lucky for me, a lot of electronic music relies really heavily on sequencing. But just like anything that is used a lot, it can kind of quickly become stagnant and predictable and a little... So today, we'll just take a few minutes to talk about some ways that I've found over the years to make my own sequences a little less predictable and maybe a little more interesting, at least. That's the hope. I think the most important question we can ask before we start to create a sequence is, how does this sequence function? And I'm not talking about a music theory-based analysis of the sequence at all. Instead, just asking the simple question, what is the purpose of this sequence? Why am I using a sequence here? What role does it play? Can kind of influence all of the decisions that you make after that question. Is the sequence like the main element of the track? Is it the main focal point? Is it almost a substitute for a melodic idea? Or is it kind of textural or tucked away in the background of the track, or something that is meant to accompany something else? Could be a rhythmic element like an ostinato. Essentially, if we can determine whether our sequence is the leader or a follower in our track, then we can make more informed, specific decisions. If the sequence happens to be the main focal point of the track, serving almost like a melodic idea, these are the common problems that I've run into in those kinds of sequences in my own music. They're often too predictable, they have no sense of direction, and they get monotonous and kind of boring pretty quickly. If you recall, we've talked about melodic writing on this channel, and some of those same issues can arise in melodies as well. They get a little cliche. So stands to reason we could probably apply some of the same concepts to our sequences. Just like a melody, the shape of the sequence I think is probably the most important thing, and we can go in and figure out the specific notes later, but first just establishing what's the overall arc of this phrase, if you think of it like a phrase. Will it start low and kind of gradually ascend as we progress throughout the sequence? Will it sort of arc somewhere in the middle and have the climax 3/4 of the way through? What if we include a large leap in there somewhere for like an accent or for emphasis, just like we would in melodic writing? Once we have the overall shape of our sequence down, a common issue that arises is also kind of a common problem in melodic writing: centering the melody or centering the sequence around one or two pitches, one or two notes. This happens when we repeat the same pitch too many times or have one or two notes that kind of the sequence kind of always seems to come back to. And it starts to have this circular feeling, like we can't escape this gravitational pull of these one or two notes. And there might be a time later in the video where that's exactly what we want to happen. But if we're thinking about more of a linear progression, that can kind of kill any momentum that we might have and get us stuck in this loop. And this opens up the whole Pandora's box of predictability versus inevitability, which I'm usually striving for the latter. I don't want my music to seem too predictable, like you could see it coming, but I want it to feel like that's what was supposed to happen, because I've tried several things and figured out the best option. I won't get too deep into that philosophy today, but if you're interested in reading more about that, I do have a free ebook on my favorite compositional concepts that have helped me the most in my own music throughout the years. That's going to be the first link in the description, and it's a free download for you if you want it. Another way I like to break up the predictability of my sequences is simply by using odd lengths. Because most step sequencers are set up in rows of 8 or groups of 16, it's very easy to get stuck, sort of going round and round in that particular grouping. So I like sequences that go across the bar line slightly or fall just short of the bar line. And I've talked about this in my ARP video as well, if you want to check that one out, about arpeggios. How if you get the harmonic aspect right, you can do some interesting things and have some ever-evolving patterns just by layering sequences of different lengths. But we'll talk about layering sequences later in the video as well. One thing I learned from all those years of playing Prokofiev is that I love melodic ideas that go across the bar line. But still feel natural, and that's kind of what I want to achieve with my sequences as well. I don't want you to be able to exactly know where the bar line is, but if there can be something that kind of bridges that gap and doesn't feel quite so repetitive, that can make a sequence feel much less predictable and cliche. If you're a rock fan, I think the band Rush is really good at this, doing things in odd time signatures, but they don't necessarily feel like they're in odd time signatures because there's always a melodic through line or a riff that goes across the bar and kind of glues everything together. If your sequences are not the main thing in your track, then we need to take a slightly different approach and oftentimes do the exact opposite of everything I just described. One of my favorite things to do, and the way a lot of my music has come about, is to set up a synth sequence and then improvise underneath that sequence. If I'm going to explore, more harmonies or more interesting chord progressions underneath a sequence, that sequence cannot contain too much harmonic information. Otherwise, it's going to lock me in to a certain key, a certain mode, a certain set of chords that maybe I want to break out of and explore other key areas. So I still think the shape of the sequence is an important concept, like that is what gives it character and makes it interesting, but including too much harmonic information is a little bit arresting if you're trying to do interesting things around it harmonically. So in this case, I think of sequences as implying harmony rather than dictating the harmony. And that makes almost no sense, but here's what I mean by that. If we're in a certain key or a certain mode, we know that we have set values for each scale degree. Maybe the easiest example of this is in a major key, we have a major third, the third scale degree is raised. And in a minor key, it's lowered a half step to a minor third. Unless I want to lock myself into either major or minor, maybe have a tasty dissonance in there somewhere that kind of rubs up against some other harmonies that I play underneath, I might conscientiously avoid the third altogether so that I don't declare whether I'm in a major key or a minor key. Composers have been using this sort of technique as a tool to create ambiguity for a long time, and this keeps more of my options open as I accompany myself or accompany my synth with the Rhodes or the piano or whatever I happen to be playing. And when you combine that with another concept we talked about earlier of creating patterns of odd lengths. Let's say we have a pattern of 5 and layered with a pattern of 8. Suddenly, what were two kind of harmonically ambiguous sequences can line up in interesting ways vertically to create something that you didn't expect and can be really inspiring, but should still work and be flexible because you haven't dictated what the harmony will be with your sequence. I do want to mention that the key takeaway from any of these videos that are more instructional are not to tell you what to do, but just to kind of give you maybe a new way of looking at things based on my experience, because that's the only thing that I can really talk about with any authority. But I think maybe the most important thing I can convey to you is don't spend so much time looking for the perfect formula or planning or trying to figure out the right way to do things that you never actually start experimenting on your own. A lot of this is trial and error. Drones are kind of boring, and depending on what kind of music you're trying to make with them, that's kind of the point, I guess. And I must admit, I love a good tasty drone myself. Wobbly tape drones, buzzy synth drones, high drones, low drones. I like drones. So today, we're going to take a look at some of my personal favorite ways to use drones, both focusing on the drones themselves and how to make them evolve and be more interesting, and perhaps more importantly, what we do around the drone that can make even the most boring drone not that way. Maybe you could think of this as drones for the active listener who might actually buy your music on Bandcamp rather than ways to get placed on that ambient drones to keep my dog from freaking out while I'm away at work all day playlist on Spotify. Now, just like our video about sequences, I think one of the most important questions to ask ourselves that will influence all of the decisions we make with our drones is, how does this drone function within the context of our track? Is it the foundation that everything else is built on top of? Does it serve as the root, as the bass note? That's often the case. Or is there just a textural element of droning happening in the background? And if the latter is true, we have a lot more possibilities of ways that we can do things like stack multiple drones, and then we can get into maybe creating some interesting, though stagnant, harmonies, and then how we move around those harmonies become really important with the other parts, and we'll get into that. Now, this is not a drone documentary, as it were, but it's safe to say that drones have been around for a long time. Hurdy-gurdy, bagpipes, sitar, Lyra 8. These are all older instruments, some of them dating all the way back to the 20 teens. But maybe the closest to my heart is an instrument that I've spent countless hours practicing over the last 20 years. Wow, that's depressing to think about. The pipe organ. Now, in Western music, you may have heard the term pedal point, and that comes directly from the organ because it has pedals. And it occurs in Western music when we sustain a bass note over a long period and there are harmonic things happening above it, chords changing. Like a lot of times you'll hear a sustained dominant in the bass and all of this stuff happening above it to create tension until we finally resolve to the tonic later on. Don't worry, it's not a theory video.
For example,
Now, if we apply a similar concept to this to electronic music, we can use it to create tension. We can use it to root us to a particular bass note, like drone, and have that be the foundation of the track. Like this appropriately named track. The bass note in this track never, ever changes, right? Interesting things have to happen above it and around it, and textures have to change in order to keep things interesting. Even the rhythm changes a bit because I activate an arpeggiator and then have that note just repeat in the bass. So we might not think of this as a traditional drone, which we think of usually as a long sustained held note like the organ, but it really functions as a drone. It's a non-changing bass note that sustains or continues, repeats throughout the entire track. It's essentially like a pedal tone or a pedal point. Well, what if we flip that concept on its head, and instead of having the drone be our foundation, be our bass note, we could move it to the mid-range or the high mids and have it be a more textural element that kind of acts like a connective tissue or a ligature, something that's a through line through an entire piece while things move around it. In my track Monuments, I did this with a Model D clone from They Who Shall Not Be Named, and on that synth you can switch off the pitch tracking for one of the oscillators, and that's what I did, and I considered having that be the root note, like we talked about in that track, Roots. I really need to get more creative with my titles. But instead, I experimented a bit and I discovered that if I tuned it to the mid-range and had the bass note and the note above it be the notes that moved around as I played, then it could create some interesting rubs. Some interesting harmonies could be created because of the way that those two notes interact on either side of that through line, the drone. I don't know if that made any sense whatsoever, but here's what I mean. Then I just improvised and experimented with some chords that I found interesting in the way that they interacted with that particular droning oscillator. And then at some point it occurred to me that, A440 worked really well in this as well to create another droning partial above that. So I used it in sort of a weird rhythmic way that I don't think they really had in mind when they put a tuning switch on the synth. This also frees up my bass line so that I can have it move around, because tracks like Roots, I love that track, but I like an interesting bass line. I feel like the bass line is the second most important thing after the melodic idea or the sequence that is the primary focus. You You can change everything that happens above something by just changing the bass note, and that's something I really like to employ, probably from all of my years as an organist, realizing that just changing the pedal note can change everything that happens above it. Now, by definition, drones don't move around harmonically. They're stagnant, as we've already talked about. And if they're somewhat exposed, like they're not shoved away in the background, kind of like in monuments, then I think it's important for them to do something texturally, since we can't do anything with them harmonically. Lately, I've really been enjoying using wavetable synths for this, wavetable synthesis, because you can sweep through the position of a really tasty wavetable, and it does highly depend on what wavetable you're using, I've discovered. And when you find those sweet spots, you can get some really interesting harmonics and textures that you wouldn't discover with just a plain old subtractive waveform. There are lots of sweet spots in there, and if you can find those and sweep through gradually with an LFO or something, that can really give a lot of character to an otherwise stagnant drone. Another thing I like to do is use tape loops. If you've heard any of my music, you'll notice that a lot of it is really noisy, and that's by design. I love tape. The wobblier and the less stable, the better. It feels almost like a cheat code, like you could run just a simple sine wave through it and record it to a wonky, wobbly tape loop. It would have so much movement and character. As long as it's not the foundation of your track, because I feel like that kind of locks you in a little bit, and there's also less room to stack things in the lower end of the frequency spectrum, as most of you probably know. It can be a lot of fun to experiment with layering drones on top of each other if they're in the mid-range or the high mids. The Lyra 8 is essentially built on this premise, and it's probably why it's so heavily featured on this track. This track was all about finding the right sort of angular harmonies. I wanted it to be a little off and not quite right. And the purpose of that was to create a sense of tension and release, but it never quite releases all the way. There's always that sense of uneasiness to it. And everything works together because I essentially tuned the Lyra 8 to play a stagnant chord using the multiple drone oscillators that the Lyra has. And then the chord progression that I had to sort of play around with and find the one that I really liked underneath that creates polychords with that stagnant chord above. And I happen to love polychords, so that was a lot of fun to play around with. So everything works together and against each other. If you'd like to learn more about how I think about putting parts together in this way, you can download my free ebook, where I compiled some of my favorite techniques and concepts that have helped me make more music over the years. We'll focus mostly on synth bass in this video, but the harmony portion of the video towards the end, that will translate to any instrumentation that you can possibly think of. Back when I started making electronic music, which was only about 10 years ago or so, I fell in love with sawtooth waves. They're really buzzy, have lots of high harmonics, and allowed me to pretend to be Rick Wakeman and shred mini-moog solos like he did in all of my favorite Yes songs. But they could also be shaved down with a low-pass filter to become a sine wave, basically. So lots of versatility, and therefore I started using them for everything, including my bass lines. But a lot of times I noticed when I would listen to my friend Tony Anderson's tracks that I could not get the same kind of earth-shattering subs that he was getting, and I didn't know how he was doing it at the time, but eventually I learned that he was layering things with some sort of sub-bass that could produce those frequencies, probably a sine wave. So I started layering a sawtooth wave, and I'd remove all of the low frequencies. I've done this in a lot of my tracks. And then I just put a sine wave sub underneath that. Because it doesn't have any high frequencies, they would work together pretty well. This is a fairly common technique. It's not earth-shattering. It's just something I had to figure out on my own. It works. It definitely works. But I found something recently that I like even better. The humble square wave. I had been modulating it for years because Nick Batt had told me to. If you know, you know. Turns out the square wave has a more solid fundamental than a sawtooth wave, and still produces a lot of those high mids frequencies, the harmonics, that help it cut through the mix, so it can kind of achieve both things at once. And while layering can work, I think if you're working on budget speakers and you can't really hear the low end very well, which was definitely the case for me when I started out, then that can be dangerous because you don't know exactly where that crossover point is. You don't know where there might be buildup happening that your room or your speakers are not revealing to you. So this is a simpler way to get a similar result. I've been doing a lot of things lately with just 2 synthesizers that I'm performing at the same time. And therefore I'm playing it live. I don't go back and multi-track it. So I want something that has that presence, but also has the solid foundation in the low end. And the square wave is working wonderfully for that. You can make space for your bass just by doing less around it. And that shouldn't really be groundbreaking, but for me, it usually is because I tend to try to do too much. And then my mixes get too busy, too crowded, and I end up having to go back and subtract things. Well, you could just leave space to begin with. Arrangement has a huge impact on mixing and how the whole production fits together. That's why I spend so much time talking about composition and that process and getting things right in that stage of the process before you get to the point where you've caused problems for yourself later on. Just spending a little bit of time considering how things might work as a conversation with each other can be really effective and save you tons of time in the mixing and mastering stages later. And you know how much I love working in an organ analogy whenever I can. In most well-written organ music, we might have a really busy pedal part, or our bass. We might also have really busy stuff going on in the hands, or the manuals. But if you study some organ music, it's usually not happening at the same time. It's conversational. They're taking turns. This is super clear in a piece that I'm currently reviving that I played in the past, the Bach D major fugue. It's one of my favorite fugues of his. And you can clearly see that even though it has a very busy fugue subject, when Bach puts it in the feet for the pedals, the stuff in the manuals is more spacious. There's more room to breathe around that. And vice versa also. When it goes to the fugue subject, which is very busy being in the manuals with the hands, the feet are just kind of punctuating, kind of providing the chord movement underneath. So how in the world does that apply to electronic music production? Well, if we have a lot of busy stuff going on in the lows and the low mids, maybe we don't have as much busy stuff going on in the upper registers, and vice versa. If the mids and highs are very busy, maybe we should chill out with our bass and let it anchor us and provide the harmonic foundation. The only thing that I love more than relating organ music to synthesizers is harmony. And the thing that I love about doing less is that you can't hide within the busyness. Every move that you make is important. because you can hear them all. And therefore, it's actually a lot harder to write something that's just 2 or 3 or 4 parts like a chorale than it is to write something with big massive chords. There's places to hide within those big chords or fast arpeggios or something. Not a lot of room to hide in something that's very exposed. So we have to choose our notes more carefully, and therefore our bass line is extremely important. As an organist, that's 2-in-1 video, there are these moments where when you're playing a piece and because you're playing the bass line with your feet most of the time, a certain harmony will lock into place. And because you're playing the room and you have these massive 16 and 32 foot pipes to support you down below, you can feel when a harmony locks into place just right. And it's almost a spiritual experience. And if you can put a bunch of those experiences in a row in a chord progression, that is the kind of bass line that I'm looking to achieve. It's not about being virtuosic or super busy with the bass line. It's about choosing the right note that locks in the vertical above it. Sometimes there's more than one note that we can choose for each vertical or each chord. And that's what I was kind of referencing in that arpeggios video. So in that chord progression that I had just written for the ARP video, I can keep the chords in the right hand exactly the same, and I can just change the bass line beneath it to really get what feels like a new set of chords, a new chord progression. And I've changed nothing but the bass underneath. This is where trial and error comes in, which is a lot of what composition is all about, experimenting with these concepts and ideas, because you'll find that you like some more than others. Some will be more effective than others. But if you can find 2 good options, then suddenly you have 2 chord progressions. And then the options start to open up for you. Maybe one could be the A section, and the next could be the B section. Maybe the whole thing becomes an 8-bar phrase instead of a 4-bar phrase, which is that loop that we were trying to break out of at the beginning. Whatever we choose to do, it will give this progression a sense of forward momentum and movement, like we're going somewhere, a sense of development. So if you're struggling to find a new set of chords, maybe you don't need a new set of chords. Maybe you need to find a new set of bass notes to go underneath those chords, because the bass will transform the vertical above it. If you don't know what I'm talking about by verticals and linear versus horizontal writing and all of these kinds of things that I reference in these videos, I do have a free ebook on harmony specifically, because I love talking about it, and it's one of the most important and impactful things that impacts everything we do as composers. All of the choices we make with our progressions, our melodies, our bass lines, everything. That's the first link in the description, and it is yours for free if you would like to download it. When I discovered the world of modern ambient music, my honest first thought was, oh, that seems pretty easy. I can do that. There really didn't seem to be a lot going on, either harmonically or melodically, which were the main points of focus for me as a composer up until that point. So, as anyone would, I grabbed a slow, evolving pad in Serum, threw some black hole reverb on it, and just drowned it entirely. And you know, that actually sounded pretty good to me. So I was like, well, I'll just make some stuff with these sounds and I'll be an ambient artist. Then I tried to add another layer to that, and then another one. And of course, everyone was equally drowned in reverb, on an insert, of course. And within the span of about 2 minutes, I had completely ruined it. It sounded like an absolute blurry mess. Maybe there's more to this than I thought. I only really discovered this loosely defined genre called ambient music about a decade ago. Late to the party, I know. I had been pretty intensely focused on my studies as a classical pianist, organist, and composer. But I'd also grown up on progressive rock. Thanks, Dad. There was one band in particular that I really loved and stood out from all of the rest to me. They had this ability to not only shred, and clearly they were all virtuosos with their instruments, but they could also kind of get the listener lost in this bed of ethereal textures from time to time when they would slow things down and pull things back. There were all these weird sounds coming and going that I had no idea how they were even making. That band was called Yes. And thinking back on it, I guess Yes was my first exposure to anything remotely resembling ambient music, even if it was usually tucked away in a 20-minute rock epic. Fast forward to about 10 years ago, and I was exposed to artists like Olafur Arnalds and Nils Frahm. That kind of reignited my passion for synthesizers and all of these electronic instruments that they were using. They had this nostalgic, vintage tape sound going on that I found to be really creative and much more accessible than the tape music I had been exposed to up until that point, which was in the art music world of the more avant-garde. So from there, I naturally thought, well, who else is making music in this kind of style? And I discovered other ambient artists like Hammock and Slow Meadow, and my good friend now, Tony Anderson, who has been a guest on this channel a couple of times. And I remember very specifically sitting in my crappy little first studio, trying to hear what I could over the traffic noise outside, and being really struck by the sounds that they were using, the depth of their mixes, all of these incredible textures that, again, I had no idea how they were achieving. It seemed three-dimensional when I was listening to it. All of these seemingly very different textures fit together really well. And it remained a mystery to me, despite me trying to make it inside of Cubase, until I started using some hardware. Eventually, I tracked things all the way back to the source, Brian Eno, who is largely considered to be the father of ambient music. And Eno was using hardware, tape machines, synthesizers out of necessity. That's kind of all there was back then. And it forced him to be creative within a set of limitations.
What you need are fewer possibilities that are more interesting. The whole emphasis of synthesizer design has been towards giving you more and more options. It's not more options that you want, it's more useful options.
Now, I don't have any hardware to sell you today. I don't review gear anymore. And I really don't think you need hardware to make any kind of music anymore. But for me, I did need that experience with hardware early on, just to fully wrap my brain around how a piece of gear can inspire you through its limitations. Using hardware totally changed the way I thought about making electronic music in general. As a pianist and organist, I really appreciated the ability to be more hands-on with an instrument and actually reach out and grab things. When I was in the box, I had this sterile environment and seemingly unlimited choices, and that just overwhelmed me, and everything kind of sounded the same. I wasn't very inspired because there was no inherent character to any of the things that I was using in the box, or at least I didn't know how to get character out of anything that I was using in the box. This is what kids today, and probably some 32-year-old in the comment section, would call a skill issue. And in my case, that's completely accurate, though a bit uninspired as an insult at this point. But something happened after I started using hardware and was forced into these limitations. I then understood how to implement those limitations inside a DAW as well. And that's the whole point of me bringing it up. I'm not trying to sell you a synth here. I'm trying to show you how to skip that step if you don't have any hardware of your own. And maybe you can start to make more interesting things in the box that you'll find inspiring to use. Let me show you an example. When I got into Eurorack, I was really intrigued by the amount of inspiration I could find just in playing with a simple clock divider. And I had never experienced anything like that in the software world. Nothing so hands-on, direct, and relatively simple that actually unlocked a whole world of possibilities for me. Now I do similar things in Ableton with this Ableton Live device, which, by the way, I highly recommend, though I'm not sponsored by them. Overall, I've started to create maybe more simple elements, and I don't mean uninteresting elements, I mean elements that are maybe in mono, so that I can layer them more easily and they don't blur together. Maybe elements that are bandpassed, so that once again, when I stack them in layers, everything feels like it has its specific place to live. This is one of the most important things in making the kind of sound beds and textures that I find the most interesting. But of course, I cannot completely ignore the 25 years of classical training that I've had. And to me, the real challenge and the real fun is finding interesting ways of combining those two worlds, the interesting sounds from ambient music and maybe the more interesting harmonic and melodic ideas from the classical, more traditional world. I think there are a lot of time-tested concepts that have stood the test of time for centuries that we can apply to any genre and still get a lot of use out of. And oddly enough, if you use these older concepts in new ways, suddenly your music sounds fresh and interesting because other people aren't doing that. Most people spend their time chasing whatever is trendy right now, without fully realizing that those are probably also the things that will be forgotten by tomorrow. If you'd like to know more about the specifics of the things that I found most helpful musically, I have a free ebook that will walk you through those concepts that are my favorites and that I use in my own music. That's linked in the description below. The OG ambient godfather himself, Eno, said that ambient music should be as ignorable as it is interesting. For a long time, I didn't fully understand that because it's never been a personal goal of mine to write ignorable music. But the way I've come to interpret that is that there's plenty of unexplored space within the world of ambient music. It can be used to create incredibly beautiful textures that will transport the listener without them having to focus on it too intently. It's just beautiful. But it can also have another level to it, of depth and craft, for those active listeners who want to peel back those layers. And I think that initial emotional weight that this kind of music can carry pulls the listener in, and that sort of depth and memorability keeps the listener there. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I want to create with my own music. So I think the very best ambient music is deceptively simple. The key is not to let the hidden complexities become a distraction. And that is a skill that goes far beyond just slapping some reverb on your favorite synth or field recording. Since the dawn of sequencers and DAWs, probably even a little bit before then, people have been focused on how to get out of the loops that they often feel stuck in. There's been lots of talk online about how to escape the loop. I might have even contributed to that talk a little bit over the years. But the thing is, sometimes I really like to loop, and for me, as a person with a classical background, it was a very different way of working that I found really intriguing in terms of how I could layer sound design and things like that I had never really experimented with before. And over the past 10 years, I've used a significant number of loops in various ways in my own music. So today, instead of trying to escape the loop or get out of loops or stop using loops, I want to talk about how to make better ones that are more interesting and that we actually want to hear over and over, because that's kind of the point. Great loops have two properties. They don't spoil the repeat before it happens, and that's something that in composition we call telegraphing. you give away the punchline before we get there, and they tell some kind of self-contained story and have their own musical shape. They themselves function like a sort of musical phrase. By the way, I have an entire ebook that's absolutely free on composition and some of these principles that I think are the most useful and have been the most helpful to me over the years. That's the first link down in the description below if you would like to check that out. It also goes into more detail about how to, develop your pieces from loop into an entire arrangement, which is kind of the escaping the loop thing that we talked about before. But let's stay focused on loops for this video. One of the most common things that I hear in the loops that just don't do it for me is that they spoil the repeat by hinting at it first. The chord at the end of the loop that is supposed to set up the repeat already gives away too much of the first chord of the loop that we come back to, so it's telegraphed. Or we might simply just have the same chord that we come back to too many times. Like if it's an 8-chord progression and 4 of the chords are C, then that gets really old. It feels like a centering chord that makes this whole thing feel like it's not progressing or going anywhere. So I like to take this to the other extreme and use a technique that's almost from serialism, which means that I never return to the same chord twice within a loop. Or if I just have like a 2-part sequence that loops, I don't ever want to repeat any of those notes again within the same sequence. And if that sounds tricky, just remember that most loops are fairly short, so it's not like you have to go through 12-tone serialism and use all of the notes of the chromatic scale before you come back around and then things get very dissonant. They don't actually have to be all that dissonant, especially if we're just dealing with like a 4-chord progression. A clear example of this is in my track Somewhat the Same from a couple of years ago, where I use this exact technique and I just create this looping progression that stubbornly repeats throughout the track while other things happen around it. But the loop itself had to be interesting enough that it wanted to be repeated. And I took a lot of care in figuring out how the last chord or the last intervals in the sequence would relate back to the first chord in the sequence, and make sure that I set up some sort of harmonic freshness every time that loop repeated. That simply means that I have it telegraphed from the last chord of the sequence to the first chord, the repeat. And once I have that established, it just took some experimentation to find a progression that I liked, the way that it looped. I was able to explore other variables with that loop as my anchor, like melody, texture, sound design. All of these things give the track its sense of progression and arrangement, but it always feels tethered to something, and that something is a very strong loop that I've set up. I just did a composition cohort with a handful of folks who all went through this process of exercises and figuring out how to write in this way together. And there are a couple members in there who have more of a science background, and we just started using the scientific term for the thing that doesn't change in an experiment. It's the thing that allows you to know if your experiments are working or not. It's your control. And I love thinking about it this way. You need one thing to anchor you while you make experiments around it. And those experiments were the other things that I mentioned, the variables of melody, sound design, instrumentation, all of that stuff. Your loop can tell a story, and I think this is one benefit that I had coming from a classical background, is I had seen so many incredible examples of phrase shapes and gestures and things that just work really well from master composers who already knew how to do this stuff and how to communicate in a way musically that felt like a conversation. I may not have known what a compressor was or an oscillator from a hole in the ground, but I did understand how even the most simple gestures can really glue a piece or glue a phrase together. So using that same example of somewhat the same, if we look at it carefully, we notice that the outer parts in that loop, in that progression, have an outward motion to them. This is called contrary motion. They're moving in opposite directions. Something that if you know about, Bach or counterpoint, you are pretty familiar with. And this outward motion provides a very distinct characteristic. It gives both parts a greater sense of independence, while also establishing this very strong gesture that is highly recognizable. If we really want to get into the weeds here of what I'm doing, what I'm thinking about when I go through the process of part writing, even if it's just two parts, I'm actively avoiding doubling. I make sure, since I only have two parts to work with, if those parts ever share the same note, double, that means that I've eliminated a part. Essentially, that the harmony gets skinnier at that particular moment. That's why I avoid things like parallel octaves at all costs, because at that point I've eliminated one of my two parts. So does this mean that I never ever double anything? No, absolutely not. There is a place for doubling, but I understand the effect that it has so that I don't accidentally eliminate some of my very important parts that I have. And if I only have two of them, probably don't want to eliminate one. So I can always go back and make adjustments, but I find that I come up with the most interesting loops and the most interesting material in general when I try to start from the place of more rich harmonic possibilities. And we do that by actively avoiding doubling. Because doubling is often, if we're keyboard players especially, that's often where we're comfortable and where our fingers naturally want to take us. And that's when you fall into the trap of everything starting to sound the same, like stuff you've done before. And I often miss out on my favorite moments if I don't give myself this sort of intentional limitation of avoiding doubling. So both of these parts, the outer parts of this progression, have their own shape to them. They are distinct, they are independent, they are memorable, they're like tiny melodies in and of themselves. So take some time to think about what sort of shapes and gestures you want your own loops to have that might make them more memorable and make them stand out a bit more. Because if we enjoy this self-contained journey or musical story that our loops tell in and of themselves, it's like a self-contained little piece, and we don't spoil the ending, the punchline, before we actually get to the repeat, then we stand a pretty good chance of getting a lot more mileage out of loops. So once you have a few highly loopable loops, there's still the matter of figuring out how to arrange them and layer them and connect them, put them together in ways that aren't quite so predictable. And if you'd like to see an entire video where I talk about a track that I made using this exact looping technique and how to arrange loops, you need to watch this video right here. Let's say you came up with this really cool looping idea. In fact, it's so cool you don't ever want to not do it again. But at the same time, you don't want to bore your listener and maybe yourself absolutely senseless in the process. Last time we talked about writing B sections and how it can be a really effective way to break up the monotony when you have a really cool idea but don't know what to do next. But the reality is you don't always need a B section. It's pretty common now to use texture and production techniques and vertical layering to achieve variation rather than the actual thematic material or progressions themselves. This is really not a new concept per se. If you're familiar with something like Ravel's Bolero, you understand that he used orchestration and texture and things like that to achieve variation, while the progression and the main thematic material pretty much keeps repeating. we're going to take some of those same things that he used in an orchestral sense and apply them to production. Now, the obvious drawback to this sort of technique is that it's really repetitive, and we really need to find something that will complement the loops and give them a sense of progression to make this sound like an arrangement and not just a pattern that keeps repeating over and over, even though it kind of is. To help with this, I use something I like to call subtractive arrangement. It's essentially where we build up all of the layers in the climax first, make sure that every piece of the puzzle fits together nicely, and then arrange outward, sort of inside out. And we do this by removing or subtracting elements as we get to the further edges of the piece or the track. And this gives the whole thing a more natural arc. So we really just need two main elements to make this whole thing work. We need the loop itself, and we need the other stuff, the stuff that surrounds the loop, comes and goes, and gives us a sense of direction in our arrangement. Now, obviously, the loop is kind of the main thing. If the loop isn't really strong, we are going to get tired of hearing it. We need a loop that can not only stand up to repetition, but kind of beg for repetition. We want to hear it again, and again, and again. And let's go inside the session of one of my older tracks. This is a track called As of Old that I wrote back in 2018, I believe. And it uses this exact method. I think it's a really good example of what I'm talking about. The whole thing started with this sequence. And guess what? If I jump to anywhere in this piece, that's going to be happening. With more delay. So you can hear I'm doing some things with the sound design to open up the filter on that particular synth sequence and give it some shape dynamically, as well as adding effects. I think there's some flanger and some delay going on in there. The second element to the loop itself is the chord progression that happens underneath. It doesn't line up one for one with the sequence. It's offset just a little bit. Neither element is incredibly complex. But I think by shifting the offset of the start of the chord progression with the sequence in an interesting way, it gives the whole thing more life. And this is just part of the process. It took a little longer to figure out how to fit those two elements together in a way that was interesting to me and that worked harmonically really well. But that's kind of part of the fun to me, is figuring out how to put the pieces of the puzzle together. By the way, if you want to see me actually write music like this from scratch, start to finish, I actually have a composition course now that teaches this type of arrangement, as well as some more linear, traditional forms of arrangement and composition like we looked at in that B section video. That's going to be linked down in the description if you want to take a closer look at it. No obligation, it's just something to give you more in-depth analysis of the kind of stuff I talk about on this channel. So I use this displaced sequencing technique quite a lot, and a lot of times I like to do it with tape loops where things never line up exactly the same way twice. And I also do it with synth sequences that are in odd meters. So like one thing will be in 4, another thing will be in 5. That's an interesting way to get more mileage out of looping ideas because you never hear them exactly the same way twice, or at least very seldom do you hear them. So now we have our looping pattern that's going to anchor this whole thing down and never change. But if I just let you hear that over and over, just like that, even with the dynamic and sort of textural changes that take place, it's going to get boring over the course of, I don't know, 3 minutes, however long this song is. I need something that's going to provide like narration over this story, right? And to do that, I use a piano melody over the top of this looping idea at the beginning. I break the monotony and sort of break out of this looping idea by just taking it higher the next time. And this is kind of that linear concept that we talked about in the last video. So just by adding that element, it's already more interesting and has more linearity to it. It has more of a sense of direction. Now, my favorite element in this entire piece are Olivia's vocals, which are just layered straight tone soprano vocals, absolutely incredible tone, a testament to a musician taking something that you write and just transforming it into something more than you imagine. And she has all these kind of like sigh motives that happen over the top of this loop. Now, this is where the subtractive arrangement thing sort of starts to come into play. You can hear how all of these things are entering at different times, whereas when I wrote it all, I sort of lined everything up together so that I could see how all of the pieces of the puzzle would fit. So if we get over to the climax over here, we have all of these elements in at their biggest point, and all of these vocal parts that are stacked on top of each other that I wrote out to work together and then sort of thinned out as we moved outside to the outsides of the arrangement. Of course it distorts because I have no idea what I was doing at this particular time in my life. Oh, those vocals are so good. I comped these vocals. In other words, I put all the parts together. It was like several takes that I put together in another session. So that's why it looks very clean here. I just took the stems out from that session and imported them in here. So I still had some flexibility, but not the parallelization of so many choices to make in this big session. So as you can hear, we just have like one element, one vocal line from that. Now, in the biggest section of this, you'll hear it open up and it sounds like I'm adding a ton, and it's really not all that much. I'm really just using all of these piano percussive ostinato layers as our percussive elements. The same core elements are happening underneath, but all of this rhythmic stuff in the pianos are happening as well. So everything together as we build into the climax sounds like this. those layers, what remains? The loop. So underneath everything, no matter what is going on above it to give the whole thing shape and direction, that loop persists. It's always present. Through the use of subtractive arrangement, using some melodic stuff in the piano to give it a sense of phrase and direction, the whole thing has a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, and it's going to hold the listener's interest far more than just a couple of elements that just loop over and over. Most importantly, it still tells a musical, emotional story, just with things like texture and production and sound design and instrumentation, rather than the actual chord progressions or melodic ideas changing too much themselves. If you've been around the channel for a while, you know that I recently moved studios to a much smaller space, and this has made me get really intentional about what's in here because I can't fit all of my synths in here at one time. I've also gotten a bit bored with programming my synth parts all the time and drawing automations into Ableton, and so I've really enjoyed having just a rack of well thought about synthesizers, a combination that I know works well together, that I can just go and play. I think that's a really important aspect that can get lost a lot of times because we can do so much stuff in post in a DAW. But if you have just some basic keyboard skills, actually playing and performing parts on hardware or with a MIDI controller if you have soft synths, that can be a really transformative thing that will make your music feel more natural than going in and drawing stuff in later. So today I'm going to show you just a few of my personal favorite ways to play a synthesizer. Hopefully these things that I've done in the past and am rediscovering now will give you some inspiration to try some new things with your own music if you like synthesizers. And if you don't, I'm not sure why you're here. Synthesizers can do a lot of different things. There are a lot of variables, and that's what we like about them. Generally, I love programming a synth patch, but it does present some problems when we go to perform that synth patch. A piano is always a piano, a pipe organ is always a pipe organ. Those are the two instruments that I was trained on and have played for decades. And because of that, it's really the limitations of those instruments, the constants, if you will, that allow you to go incredibly deep and get to know the instrument incredibly well. And that's what we spend decades perfecting our technique on, those set limitations that the instrument has. We learn those constants incredibly well and learn to manipulate the few variables that we do have to make it more expressive. For example, the pipe organ, not velocity sensitive. Doesn't matter how hard you press a note, it's not going to get any louder. So the variables that we do have are stop selection. The sounds themselves we can change on an organ. And articulation, the way that we play each note. Do we play a passage legato? Do we put space between each note? We can actually fake an accent by putting a little space before the note that we want to feel like is accented. The piano has a fairly fast decay, but it is velocity sensitive, so we can use those two aspects to create the illusion of a connected melody, a connected line. Things that a singer or a violin player could do very naturally, we have to sort of fake at the piano through a technique called decay matching. Because the piano is a percussion instrument. Yeah, it's a percussion instrument, it's not a string instrument. You don't play the strings, you smack the strings with hammers. Because of that, it's very easy for a note to pop out of the texture, to pop out of the melody or the line, and sort of disrupt that line. With a synthesizer, a lot of those constants become variables, and we get to decide how the instrument is going to respond. So that's why I like to say we don't really play the synth. There is no technique for a synth. There's a technique for each patch, because each patch has its own set of constants and its own set of variables that either we or the sound designer who made the patch has predetermined. So here are some common patch playing techniques that I have used over the years and I'm rediscovering as ways to sort of provide inspiration for my new music that I'm currently working on. First off, how many voices does your synth have? How many notes can it play at a time? You can play a monosynth in a very different way than you can play a polysynth. It's much more forgiving in a lot of cases. That's why it's easier to shred, do synth solos on a monosynth, because there is no danger of sort of splatting a wrong note, because it's just going to steal the one voice and make it sound like the right note. You can never play two notes at a time. My track Grounded is a direct result of exploring this voice limitation. One voice, so as I play two notes at a time, I'm trying to see what sort of interesting ways that voice can be stolen between the two notes that I'm playing or holding down at once. So the voice stealing limitation is not a bug, it's a feature in this track, part of the performance. Ow! Even polysynths typically, though you can play more than one note at a time, they still have a limited number of voices, especially an analog polysynth. The Muse back here, it's right there, only has 8 voices. The Prophet 12, which is in another room now, has 12. The Polyevolver only has 4 voices to play at once, and that's a limitation. And a limitation is an opportunity. I can get away with longer release times on a synth with just 4 or 6 voices, because the voice stealing is going to dictate that that release time can never build up to a point where it gets incredibly muddy. And the voices can steal from each other in kind of an interesting and pleasing way that we wouldn't necessarily expect. And from a harmony standpoint, which you know I love to talk about, just restricting yourself to 4 or 5 voices can really inspire you to do some interesting things and write in a linear style rather than always thinking about vertical blocked chords, which is something that I talk about more in my free composition ebook, which I've referenced many times. It's still down in the description below if you haven't grabbed that. When you have to think linearly like this, it can make the individual parts, because you're thinking about how one note in a chord moves to the next note in the next chord, much more carefully. It can make your parts a lot stronger. A paraphonic synth like the Pro 3 or the Matriarch, both of which I love very much and have used a ton, has a slightly different architecture which allows you to use different techniques. And I explained a lot more in detail about that in a video from a couple years ago. Now, the Matriarch has 4 oscillators that can all be played simultaneously, but all of them are fed into the same mixer, the same filters, they're stereo filters here on the Matriarch, and the same filter and VCA envelopes. So you could think of the Matriarch's architecture and the way that this paraphonic synth is structured as being like a funnel, where all of the oscillators feed into the same signal path, and they come out the end all sharing the same VCA, the same filters, the same everything. And that's in contrast to the Prophet 6, which would be all parallel. Lately, I've been really enjoying playing the Sub 37 in paraphonic mode, because it forces the 2 oscillators that it has, which you play at the same time, through the same filter and VCA, so it can lead to some really interesting distortion and ways that the filter interacts with those 2 oscillators being sort of squeezed through it. also get to decide which oscillator gets the high part and which gets the low part. And if you swap around the octaves of the oscillators as you're playing, it can lead to some really interesting results. I also love using paraphonic synthesizers for ARPs because of the way that it can round robin through each oscillator, even though it's, once again, being squeezed through the same filter and VCA. And then changing the waveform of each oscillator or the octave mid-ARP can lead to even more interesting results. The travel after you press a key does absolutely nothing on a piano or a pipe organ. But on a synthesizer, it can do a whole lot of things, and it's one of my favorite means of expression when playing a synth. This is called aftertouch, and because I use both hands a lot when I'm playing a polysynth, it's one of my favorite ways to go about interjecting some modulation into a patch while I play. Usually I use a combination of aftertouch and an expression pedal rather than riding the mod wheel because, once again, both of my hands are usually tied up playing parts. Maybe the aftertouch adds some noise to control the filter, and the expression pedal can also control the overall cutoff of the filter. The possibilities there are fairly endless depending on what synthesizer you have and the modulation capabilities or mod matrix that it might have. And more polysynths today are featuring polyphonic aftertouch like the Iridium back here. And that is wonderful. It can provide an even more expansive means of being expressive over your patches because suddenly you have modulation control over each individual voice or each individual note, especially on sustained pads and things like that, which I absolutely love. I made a whole video about, which, is pretty evident in my music that I like slow, sustained things. MPE synths like the Osmos, which unfortunately I don't have to demonstrate for you, take this even further with even more means of expression. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful thing that companies are starting to explore more ways to interact with a traditional keyboard. One of my favorite means of inspiration or inspiring myself to play in a different way is interjecting some sort of rhythmic or clocked, synced modulation into a patch. And the purpose of this, once again, is not necessarily just set it and forget it or soundtrack by playing one note, but it's how I interact with it once that rhythmic element is going and I'm playing the patch live. Maybe I could have one clocked square wave LFO set to change the pitch of oscillator 1 by octaves. Maybe another LFO set to a different clock division could open and close the filter. Suddenly, I'm interacting with this patch in a very different rhythmic way, and the harmonies that I choose and when I change them are completely changed than they would have been without it. This is often the jumping off point for an entire track for me, can really inspire me to develop an idea. I love long sustained pad sounds, and one issue that we can have with them is too much buildup. Like I mentioned before, voice limitation can help with this, but sometimes we just need to learn a technique which comes directly from the pipe organ, finger legato or finger substitution. We can dial down the release time a little bit so that one chord doesn't blur into the next one too much and still have connected chord changes. Also, if you write linearly, like I've talked about in my ebook, that helps with this. This also avoids having to use a sustain pedal so much because that can also lead to muddiness. Rather than just picking up your fifth finger and moving it to the next note, what if we substituted our fifth finger for our fourth finger so we could hold that note down and then have our fifth finger available to play the next note without breaking the phrase, breaking the line? This is how organists think. The organ is a more horizontal way of playing than even the piano. There's no sustain pedal to help us, and as soon as we release a note, it stops. So to play legato, we have to use finger substitution. And one thing that my first organ teacher taught me was the more intentional and rhythmic we can make our finger substitution, the more musical it feels, and the more it feels like just part of the performance. So I like to do finger substitutions in time, in rhythm, like a subdivision. Like if I'm playing quarter notes, I would do my finger substitution on the eighth notes. Everything so far has been about playing a synth live without the aid of a sequencer or an arpeggiator. That does not mean that I am anti-sequencer or anti-arpeggiator, much to the contrary. If you are at all familiar with my music, you know that I use them all the time. But to me, the most interesting thing about sequences and arps are what they inspire me to do around them. How do I choose parts that fit within or around the sequence in an interesting way? One of my favorite things about the Muse is the way that the sequencer and the arp interact with one another. So I can actually play live an arpeggiated part in a different time division than the sequencer, which is running in the background. And because I have 8 voices, there's plenty of voices to do everything at once. I've done the same thing with the Sub 37, which interacts in a very different way when it's in paraphonic or duophonic mode by feeding it a MIDI sequence while I'm playing those two parts together. And that basically feels like the sequence and me performing are fighting against each other in interesting ways because it's constantly trying to steal voices between one or the other. And that has been really inspiring and has led me recently to create some things that I would never have come up with without that. So once again, the limitation of only being able to play 1 or 2 notes at a time with the Sub 37 becomes a feature. So I've just thrown a whole lot of ideas at you, but if I could boil it down to just 3 sentences, I would say, we don't play the synth, we play the patch. And the busier your patch, the more spacious your playing needs to be to accommodate for it. And thirdly, and most importantly, just use your ears. If you're playing something that doesn't fit with the patch, adjust your playing to accommodate the patch, or vice versa. But in my experience, once those 2 variables lock in and your performance lines up well with what the patch is programmed to do, that's where the real magic can happen, and that's what often inspires me to create entire tracks, entire pieces of music. So if you think about synths as being limitless possibilities of endless potential of sounds, that can be too overwhelming. But if I think about what are the limitations that can be most inspiring to me, that's when I actually get work done. I've been making music for about 2 decades now, and just in the past 6 or 7 years, people have actually started listening to some of it, which has been kind of a nice surprise, I have to say. But even still, sometimes I just feel like I've run out of all of my good ideas. And whenever that happens, I go back to my very first composition lesson. And in that lesson, my composition teacher gave me something that has continued to help me to this day. And I've come to call it a prompt, a term I was using even before all of the super cool AI kids. In that lesson with Italian-American composer Luigi Zanninelli, he gave me a very specific assignment. It was one of my very first assignments, in which I was supposed to write a set of children's pieces for piano, which was my primary instrument, so that made a lot of sense. And if he had just stopped there and said, go write some children's pieces, I would have been insulted and confused at the same time. It's like, why am I just writing children's pieces? And also, where do I start? How in the world do I write a set of children's pieces for piano. It would have been way too open-ended, and no doubt I would have written some super cliche nonsense that was kind of meandering and unfocused and all over the place. But in his infinite wisdom, his one rule was that I could only have 3 notes sounding at a time. In other words, no chord could contain more than 3 notes. In other words, do more with less. He basically gave me a defined problem to solve, and that forced me to come up with solutions that I would have never even considered otherwise. So that's exactly what I did. That gave me a reference point, and that turned into the set of waltzes that you're listening to right now. So I discovered that I could have more than 3 parts if I wanted, if I figured out clever ways to sort of play them off each other. And that would avoid breaking the rule that he gave me of having more than 3 notes sounding at a time. And I think this was the first time it really hit me just how limitations can impact our creativity. It focuses our creativity instead of restricting it. He was so clever in this assignment in that he got me to reveal that to myself just by giving me a simple guideline. So you may have seen Brian Eno's oblique strategies, and I've started kind of doing something very similar for myself when composing, which is just giving myself a prompt. It can be very simple, it can be somewhat abstract, but then I have to figure out creative ways to use that prompt. Really just some compositional guidelines to help me get out of the occasional rut that I find myself in. And I think we probably all find ourselves in that rut from time to time. So in this video, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples that I've been using recently so that you can see how to start to apply this concept for yourself, and hopefully it can help get you out of your ruts as well. Back when I was a student singing in college choirs, one of my directors had this tuning exercise that we would use as a warm-up before rehearsals. And he would have us just sing a 4-part chord. In other words, each one of us, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, had our own assigned part, our own assigned note to hold. And then while the other 3 parts held their notes, he would start moving one of the parts chromatically in half steps. And then he would start moving 2 parts at a time. And depending on which parts he moved and when he moved them, it resulted in some really interesting harmonies that we probably never would have come up with if we were just thinking about vertical chord progressions. So I've been thinking, what if I took this idea, this concept, and turned it into a compositional prompt for myself, since I'm always talking about how to write linearly and horizontally instead of thinking in vertical chords. So this prompt kind of forces us into that way of thinking that I describe in my free composition ebook, which is down in the description below. It gives a lot of these concepts that I found super helpful if you're interested. If you find yourself stuck in a set key signature or something, or a very functional way of thinking about putting chords and harmonies together, chromaticism is a great way to get yourself out of that way of thinking, because you have to think about how each part moves to the next note in the next chord. And basically the entire chromatic scale is available to you instead of being stuck in a mode or a key. Since we're already thinking about chromaticism, let's try something else along those lines. A lot of times when I'm improvising at church, and sometimes I'll improvise the offertory or something, I like to start with dissonant intervals that maybe obscure where I'm going or where I am at the time, so the listener isn't quite sure. And then I like to try to figure out ways to work my way out of that into something that makes sense. When we're composing, this is kind of like trying to write yourself out of a corner. Like, if I'm any good, I should be able to make this work by what I do with it. So for this prompt, let's have a 5 interval sequence that repeats. The starting pitch The starting note for both parts is going to be middle C, and then I'm going to start moving outward chromatically. To make things more interesting and give myself a little bit more opportunity for contrast, I can have one part that has one leap in it. In other words, an interval larger than a half or whole step. I can also have one whole step in one of the voices. So all chromatic movement except one leap and one whole step somewhere I can choose. So then I might come up with something like this. If you've been around a while, you've probably heard me say something along the lines of changing the bass changes everything. So now I can take this weird sequence and experiment with different root notes underneath it, different bass notes underneath it, different harmonic rhythms based on how fast the bass changes. So let's choose 3 different bass notes to try under this sequence as a whole, and then experiment with changing them at different times during the sequence just to see what happens. Trial and error. It's an empirical process. So are you starting to see how this can lead to really inspiring and interesting results that we would have never considered or stumbled upon if we were just sort of meandering around, jamming away with an arpeggiator? Anytime we start with a blank page, we either go to what we've already done a million times before, or we're so overwhelmed that we just start throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks, and a lot of times it just sounds unfocused and incoherent by the time we get to the end. This is when overwhelm typically kicks in for me. But just having something to anchor us, as simple as these prompts are, that allows us to explore more freely because we are tethered to something. It's like we have an anchor, and then we can explore around that and see what interesting things are there without the fear of getting lost at sea.